Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. Our guest this week is certainly a fan favorite. He is chairman of Nanos Research Group, Canada's foremost public opinions polling firm. He is a man equally loved and feared by Canadian politicians, Nik Nanos. Hello, Nik, and welcome back to Hitting Home.
And great to join you folks and all your viewers.
Oh,
definitely, I don't think it's, well, it might actually be an understatement on my end of this about fan favorite. Absolutely glad to have you back, Nik. I just want to set the tone, though, if we might, Mike and Nik, just to give our audience a bit of an idea, a bit of set the mood. Give us some background on the science of polling and data interpretation, Nik, just so that we can understand who we're talking to, what we're talking about, and sort of what are some of the constraints that we should keep in mind as we talk about polling.
Well, the thing is one thing that's changed in the last 20, I've been doing this now for 35 years. One thing that's changed is that at the beginning, it'd be like a poll once a month, a poll once a year, that kind of stuff. Now we're into, and this is critical, high velocity data where people want information and insight almost every day. And, for us, for example, we monitor consumer confidence on behalf of Bloomberg News, and we monitor the political situation. We're now doing it every week. We're releasing polls basically every week because people want to know that if there's a new trend emerging, they want to know about that immediately. They don't want to learn about it 4, 5, 6 weeks later. They want to know immediately that something is happening. So one of the big changes in the last 30 years is the appetite for data, and also the integration of data with public opinion data with economic data, right? In order to understand where things are going.
And one trend that would be inflation and housing in Canada. It's been a top issue with Canadians in 2023. Well, what does the data suggest? Is this sentiment building or waning with Canadians as we come to the end of the year?
No, it's building. It's building. And, it's directly related to the perceptions related to real estate, people trying to pay for the rent or the mortgage, people paying for the groceries, interest rates. And, the thing is here's a prediction. I think the next federal election, whether it happens in 2024 or 2025, might very well be on housing. That could be the defining issue, because you know what? Everybody needs a place to live, and it affects everyone. Usually elections are fought on things like jobs or healthcare or free trade and stuff like that. I think we're going to see a housing, election coming up. People are going to want to know, what are elected officials doing at all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal? What are they doing to create an environment where housing can be affordable and that we have the housing that we need? But, right now, housing and inflation, those things have been trending up and been the key focus. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, everybody. Everyone's going to be worried about paying for the rent, the mortgage, paying for the groceries in the next 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. I know we definitely want to talk. I mean, this show traditionally for the last 6 or so years has talked about real estate, finance, those types of things. So certainly that's going to be a meat of some of our conversation today. But you touched on a couple of things, Nik, and that is really the speed of information, and also really, I would say over the last 20 years, the change in consumer habits, or the change in the way we consume information. It's more readily available, good, bad, or otherwise. And so how has that changed your industry? How has that changed the way you do things? You no longer have 6 months to prepare a report.
Yeah, we're lucky. The thing is we're lucky to have like 6 days to do a report. One of the things, it's become more expensive to do research. You might think that with online surveys and stuff like that. We do online surveys. We do telephone surveys. Believe it, we're calling people cell phone numbers, because one thing that's changed is now we're calling people cell, because landlines are on the decline. But one of the things that I find quite striking about what's going on is that the opinion is now feeding consumer behavior. So think of it this way. If people think that the economy is going to be on the downturn, maybe they can afford to make a real estate purchase. Maybe they can afford to buy a truck or a car or a large appliance. But what happens is they see where things might be going. They see the data out there and go, hey, you know what? Things might be a little tough in the next 6 months. So what happens? They delay the purchase that they can afford. They can delay the purchase that, under any other circumstances they would do, because they have this extra information. So one of the things we have to really watch out for now is how those opinions that we're tracking actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy that if, if people think, oh, 2024 might not be as great as other years, they might delay or scale back a purchase, and that has a material impact on our gross domestic product.
Like, I'm laughing. You know why I'm laughing. First of all, Nick, you're in my head, so get out my head. but really, I mean, these are some of the things that we've talked about recently, Mike. Even you and I talked about that self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough people are talking about it, if enough people are talking, and we'll get into this later, even maybe regarding the R word, the big R word. If enough people are talking about it, then corporations start pulling back on spending and households pull back on spending. Let me leave that for a second and ask you this question, though. Facts versus fiction or opinion as it relates to polling. What's the difference between what's right in terms of by logic versus convenience? And when I think about that, I'm thinking about the interest rates that you talked about. If interest rates have gone up 400%, that's definitely more than just an inconvenience. But what's right versus wrong when it comes to opinions versus facts?
Well, I'll tell you one of the scariest types of research that we've done has to do with trying to measure the ability of people to delineate between what is the truth and what is a falsehood. So get a load of this. So we do these, and these are academic projects. So we've done research with the University of Toronto and also the University of Calgary, and then we do research on stuff that, for example, would say, we're going to read you a bunch of statements, and we'd like you to say, do you think this statement is likely true or likely false? And there'd be statements like, NATO is the aggressor in the war between Russia and Ukraine, right? Things that are obviously. Another statement would be, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation created the COVID-19 virus. Like stuff that is like, there's no way you get this wrong. Anyways, what we found is that, more than 1 out of every 10 Canadians would believe things that we know empirically are fundamentally false.
Yeah, that's a product of the news cycle, but just as much, maybe more our social media too.
It's social media, Mike. You've actually put your finger on it exactly. Here's another thing. So then we'd ask the question, how many times in a week do you share your opinions on social media? And can I tell you something? Arif's laughing. If you say 0, congratulations. The probability of your ability to tell the difference between a truth and a falsehood is very, very high. The more you post your opinions, and I don't want to out either of you folks, either Arif or Mike on this, the more you share your personal opinions, and I'm not talking about pictures of kitty cats and dogs, right? Personal opinions on the internet, the less likely you are to be able to tell the difference between the truth and a falsehood. And Mike, this goes back to what you're saying. So there's public opinion, and then all the stuff that's on social media, which is a contaminating factor out there.
I am dying. You're
dying right now. People going on your social media feed and going, Arif seems to have a lot of opinions.
And the amount of time that I have to bite my tongue, and I secretly pray that somebody else will express my opinion for me, because I have to watch, public opinion, right? Recovering politician, and who knows what's down in the future. But if I say what I actually think, that could have damning implications. So anyway,
But what is interesting is despite the the doom and gloom scenarios out there, are the movement of our economy, all the challenges that are in our face every day, and that I think overall Canadians are still content with being Canadian. And what are the major contributing factors that you see through your polling that keep Canadians glad to be Canadians?
Well, when we test on, a whole bunch of institutions and whether they contribute or don't contribute to Canada being a better country. And actually at the very top of the list are two things, our university college sector and also our healthcare system. And, everybody gripes about the healthcare system, but, the thing is, the reality is compared to a lot of other things, the things that are not contributing to people are less likely to say are contributing to Canada being a better place is like all of our political institutions, like just name them, the Senate, the House of Commons, the Prime Minister's office, that kind of stuff are not seen as contributing. But Mike, to your question, one of the worrisome trends that we're seeing is that when we ask Canadians to score their satisfaction with Canada as a country, it's actually been on the decline in the last 3 years. Yeah. And it's like a 10-point scale, right? I think it's at like 6.1 or 6.2 out of 10, which is, you know what? If the kids came home with a 61%, we'd go, I think there's some work that we have to do. The kicker on this is that when we ask Canadians that are under 35 years of age, they score their satisfaction with Canada as a country, I believe it's a 5.6, which is like a D. Right now, young people are the most pessimistic, and this is contrary to 35 years of polling experience. They're graduating with school with debt. They're underemployed or unemployed. The rent is expensive. You know, think about buying a car or doing all those things that their parents did, and it just seems unachievable. And right now, young people are the most pessimistic than they have been on record, and they're much more pessimistic than old folks like us.
So let me ask you a couple questions around that then. How much, we talked a moment ago about social media, how much of it is the company you keep, the echo chamber you might be in? But that's not to take away necessarily from the fact that their rent is higher, that they are graduating with more student debt. So they're more vocal about it. But we also live in a world where geographic boundaries don't have the same sort of control that they used to in terms of the ability to work or work remotely. So is any of that at play?
Yeah. You know what? Social media is a major negative contributor to people's mental health. And, you know, let's face it, I know about you folks. I go on social media. I feel inadequate when I see all the trips everybody's doing and the things that they're doing. It's like, well, I don't have time to do the 5-course meal and take pictures with me, whatever, chopping up a roast chicken or whatever it might be, or going on a fancy vacation. So, you know, should we be surprised that social media is undermining, you know, people's mental health? And, you know, think of all the time that young people spend on social media. Yeah. So, you know, it's just one of those things where it's feeding itself.
Yeah, for sure. I just, last couple of hotel rooms I've been in, I couldn't hear the beach from the room. That's for sure.
I just like to say, Mike, that sounded kind of weird. You know, are you staying in the hotel rooms or are you just visiting? Or
just visiting. I think the last one was in Ottawa. Last time we were there for the political action committee.
Yes, event. That's when we saw each other.
And that's right. And what was interesting there, and it ties back to something you said earlier, is the focus on housing. Now, housing may be the predominant issue in the next election. I've been doing that for a dozen years.
With that in mind, Mike, I'm going to let you hold that thought. When we come back, you plugged Ottawa. Yeah. When we come back from this break, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Ottawa. But stay with us for more invigorating conversation with Nik Nanos. We'll be right back after this break on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're here with Nik Nanos from Nanos Research. Thank you again, Nik, for joining us today. And was saying just before Arif cut me off so bluntly, just before the break there, we were both in Ottawa. You're in Ottawa a lot. I'm there at least once a year for the last dozen years or so with the Political Action Committee for the Canadian Real Estate Association. And we're there to lobby with the politicians about different things that we are concerned about with housing and affordability and everything else. I got to say, though, this year, the politicians were leaning in and they were listening hard to what we had to say, contrary to previous years where they politely listened, but you could get a real sense that housing and the whole housing affordability and availability issue is top of mind with the politicians. So hopefully that translates into action over the coming months. So, but
I think that's definitely going to happen, actually, because, you know, we have the Liberals who are on the ropes and the Conservatives who want to win. Like, and the NDP, they're still talking about pharmacare. I was surprised that they didn't talk about housing, because for the New Democrats, housing, like social housing even, should be like a no-brainer. So it's kind of like they had a playbook from last year that they kind of dusted off, and no one said, hey, by the way, everyone's focused on housing, not pharmacare. But anyway.
Yeah. Listen, I want to say this, though, Nik. You've always presented yourself and your brand as apolitical, unbiased,
Yes.
and just calling it like you see it. And I think that that is important. I will tell you, I'm picking up a sense of bewilderment, though, from you, that you're like, the polls, I'm reading between the lines, that the polls are so obvious, that the numbers are so obvious, and that they're not reading what's right in front of their face. Tell me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so we have a policy of not doing work for any political party. So we're complete because of the work that we do with the Globe, CTV, and Bloomberg. It's been like that for decades. So I read the polls, and it's kind of like, and this applies to, we talked about the New Democrats, like, why aren't they focused on social housing when that's such an important issue? And you know what, they're trying to compete with the Liberals for that progressive vote. And I look at the Conservatives, who currently have the upper hand, right? They have a significant advantage over the Liberals in the polls. Pierre Poilievre is running high in the polls. And what the Conservatives have to realize is, now when people are looking at them, they're thinking that they might be the next government. They're a government in waiting. So, I look at the numbers and like, you better get ahead of this. If you want to consolidate whatever you've done, you've got to start to share a vision. People know that there's a problem with the Liberals, but they're going to want to know, what are you going to do on housing? How are you going to create jobs and prosperity? Who's going to be in your cabinet? That, for the Conservatives, they're going to need to get ahead of that. And for the Liberals, right? They've been in power since 2015. They're looking like a tired government. They have to explain to Canadians why they deserve their votes. Like, what's left to do in the Justin Trudeau government? So, you talk about bewilderment. I'm kind of like, it's more like scratching my head. Is like, aren't any of you folks reading the numbers? Like, you should be talking about housing. Yeah. The Conservatives, start to build yourself as a government in waiting. Liberals, if you don't, it's not enough for you to take pot shots at Pierre Poilievre, which the Liberals like to do. The Liberals have to say, here's what's left to do in our mandate. And we're a least risky choice than the Conservatives. But I don't know. It's like they're in their own little world.
Yeah, they're going to their old playbook. They're not thinking on their feet. But all of these dynamics you're mentioning here, like, how much of this, given the time that you've been paying attention to Canadian politics, how much do you think it's just part of the cyclical nature of Canadian politics, or should we be surprised by the polling numbers that we've been seeing here and how they're moving?
Well, we shouldn't be surprised by the overall trend, because every government has a best before date. The other thing is, I'm going to put a little asterisk. The Conservatives have like a double-digit lead over the Liberals, but the thing is that the election is not being held today, right? And there's no repercussions for voting Conservative, right? Because if you're disappointed with the Liberals, you'll be like, I'm voting Conservative because it's time for a change. So I believe, the Conservatives, they obviously do have an advantage, but it's kind of like a stock. It's overpriced a little bit, right? And that there'll be a little bit of a technical correction where the Conservative advantage will still exist. It just won't be as strong as the numbers suggest now, because we're not in an election cycle.
Well, and we've seen other parties go, literally 2 weeks before an election, go in with a double-digit lead.
Oh, man.
Out or whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, what I was going to say, why don't we talk about Ontario politics for a second? If you remember John Tory and Dalton McGuinty, remember, it was like, I think it was the Fibberals. Was that what they were calling him, with the nose growing and shit like that? Sorry, I don't know if I can say that word, but anyways.
All good here.
And it was like, everybody thought the election was over. John Tory had like a double-digit advantage, right? And the Dalton McGuinty was the leader of the Liberal Party. Everybody had counted him out because he'd been in power for a while. And then go figure, something happened during the campaign, specifically related to education funding. And then what looked like a progressive conservative lock in Ontario, they lost. Same thing happened with the Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak. Tim had a significant advantage. And there were some problems with his. It's nothing that he did, but there was a problem with his platform. Oh. And all of a sudden,
one statement turned that around.
Yeah,
the power of media. They did not let him squeak the word attrition into his platform. They whited out the word attrition. They just said, you're firing 100,000 people.
But the thing is, Arif, to your point, from a polling perspective, before both of those elections, if we were to sum up the polling, people were saying, I'm not voting Liberal. I'm not voting Liberal. I'm never voting Liberal again. I've had enough of the Liberals. And then on election day for both those elections, it'd be like, I can't believe I'm voting Liberal. I did not want to do this, but I've had to vote Liberal because it's seen as being a less risky choice.
And one of the things Nanos research compiles is something called a power index that of each of the party leaders. Can you tell us a little bit about the power index, what it is, and what the data tells us, like beyond the obvious, about the path of the current federal parties?
Sure, Mike. The power index is a roll-up to measure the brand strength of a political party. So it includes whether people are voting for the party, whether they would consider or be open to voting for the party, what they think of the leader, whether the leader has the qualities that people like, whether they prefer that person to be the prime minister for the federal power index. So it kind of rolls up all these things into a score out of 100. So here's what's interesting in terms of what's going on right now. So Justin Trudeau has been the leader of the Liberal Party for 10 years, right? He's only been the prime minister since 2015. He's been the leader since 2013, right? And when he became leader, you remember that guy, Michael Ignatieff, right? Mm-hmm. Wasn't a very good time for the Liberals federally. Then anyways, when he took over the leadership, the power index score, which is the brand index score for the Liberals, were like in the 50s. And it ramped up significantly when he won his majority government, like way up. Now it's in the low 40s. So what does that mean? That means that the Liberal Party, the brand strength of the Liberal Party right now is lower than when it was when he took over the leadership, when the Liberal Party were in third place, in trouble under Michael Ignatieff. It's kind of like, I know one thing, just anecdotally talking to staffers and stuff like that, and politicians, they want to know what the support was before they started and what the support was when they finished. And it'd be like, if the party's doing better than when I finish, it'd be like, congratulations, I've done a good job. If the party's doing worse than it's like being given an inheritance of $100. If you get an inheritance of $100 and then after 10 years, right, you've got 60, it'd be like, well, man, that's not good. If you have an inheritance of $100 and then it becomes 160 or 120 or whatever, then you're thinking you've done a good job. So the Liberal brand strength is lower now than when it was when Justin Trudeau took over. So his legacy, at least if he were to step down today, would not be that great.
So there's a couple of things that come to mind, and one of them is that, we didn't know anything about Justin necessarily when he took over. And I think there was a lot of that opinion was, oh, well, he's going to carry the legacy of his father. Like him, hate him, doesn't matter. There was a strong brand with the father, and there was an assumption that would have been genetically passed down. I don't believe it's turned out that way. Now, if you look at the last 3-4 years, though, Canada, and you talked about this earlier in your comments around social media, I should pose this as a question. Your thoughts on Canada's brand as a divided or a harmonic people?
Yeah. StatsCan did an interesting study where it asked Canadians and recent immigrants exact same questions. How would you rate Canada on shared values? How would you rate Canada on human rights and shared values related to a whole bunch of things? And this study by Statistics Canada suggested that if you were born in Canada, you were less likely to think that we were united than if you had arrived from Canada in your lifetime. And to me, what that suggests is that there's a fundamental disconnect that's going on right now where there's a significant proportion of Canadians who are born in Canada. Let's set aside whatever their background is, because that's immaterial. The only marker is you're born in Canada versus you're not born in Canada. So for those Canadians that are born in Canada, they're less likely to feel that we're unified and have a common set of values compared to people that come from other places.
You have to imagine, though, unless it's me, here we go, facts versus opinion, unless I'm completely out to lunch, I think that it's quite a palpable decline of that, what's the word I'm looking for, of that sense of unity.
Yeah.
In the last few years.
But one of the reasons we don't have that sense of unity is, so I can tell, Arif, talking to you and Mike, you remember the days when there were fewer channels, right? When there were fewer news outlets, when social media didn't exist. How about that? I know, Mike, you're looking pretty good. Maybe you do you remember when social media didn't exist? Anyways, And you know what? In those olden days, why don't we say pre-1990, we had shared experiences. Do you know what? Because there's no such thing as TV on demand. We watched, not to sound like a goof, Thursday night you watch Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days. I'll make this up, right? Everybody talked about it the next day. We had shared experiences. You know, we all had basically similar news, and it created a common base for people to talk and to deal with all these issues. But today, with social media and also the fragmentation of media writ large, people can be in their own little worlds, right? Like they can watch news from, like, I'll just use a personal example. My mother, who's Greek, watches news from Greece. She probably watches more Greek news than she does Canadian news, except when I'm on TV. She watches that. That's the only thing she watches. But anyways, beyond that, she's more plugged into the news and what's happening in Greece than she is in Canada. It's a sad state of affairs because I have to tell her about what's going on in the country. But that fragmentation means that we have fewer shared experiences and points of information. And, should we really be surprised that there are fewer things that connect us?
Yeah, those are interesting observations. And I know we're coming up to the end here. So I'll just say that the fall economic statement, it came out yesterday in the House. When we come back from break, let's delve into that a little bit. I got some questions on that I think Arif and I would like to hear some answers on. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Nik Nanos on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We're here with Nik Nanos from Nanos Research. The fall economic statement was tabled in the House this week. Some funding for our housing situation, which is dire at best, but mainly, money for green initiatives. And certainly, as to be expected, it was met with disfavor from the opposition leader. Are the details of the fall economic report likely to help or hinder the Liberal Party's polling? Do you think there should be more focus, more effort with regards to housing in there? Any thoughts?
Well, the Liberal Party numbers are, the Liberals are on the ropes right now when it comes to the trend line and ballot support and stuff like that. I can't see this. I would be very surprised to see this economic statement turn them around. And, I'm not surprised on the environmental stuff because they're just reeling from the carbon taxed walk down in Atlantic Canada. And you know what? Now we've got a pylon from premiers basically across the country. You put up the hand and said, hey, a heating oil. I don't think people in my province should be paying for a carbon tax on heating oil. So I think they had that green initiative in there to help ameliorate or control some people who are environmentally focused, who are disappointed, right? That of the walk back on the environment. But the fact of the matter is, Mike, the government is running significant deficits. There's only so much room for them to do anything. And on the housing stuff, it's the federal government on its own cannot do anything. Like realistically, if they wanted to actually move the numbers, they should say, listen, we're going to have a meeting, a federal, provincial, municipal meeting just to talk about housing strategy. And then we're going to talk about what municipalities are going to do, what provinces are going to do. And if the feds want to play in this area, because it's not a responsibility, what money they're going to put on the table.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, though, because if you listen to what the leader of the opposition is talking about, that's what he's certainly been driving home, no pun intended, for the last 6-9 months, is that if and when I'm prime minister, we may not be directly involved in housing, but we are involved in other initiatives like infrastructure funding that we can tie as a carrot and a stick to housing with the provinces and the municipalities. What is it that you think, the current federal government is just not willing to dive into that territory?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they've made some big promises on the environment. They've made some big promises on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, like big ticket items, and they're now starting to talk about trying to trim government because the body count of individuals in the federal civil servants and the federal civil service has increased dramatically. I think it's something like 30%, compared to when the Conservatives were last in power. So, and it's kind of for the Liberals, it's kind of like over the last years they've made their bed, and now politically, and now there's just no fiscal room to do what they want to do. I think that's why they're in a difficult spot right now.
Mike, if you don't mind, I'll jump into this. I want to talk about the recession because we are struggling. The numbers suggest that we are struggling certainly inside our own homes. We're struggling with the fact that interest rates have gone up 400%. Some might say in terms of the actual variable rate impact on interest rates. Inflation hit somewhere around the 9%. I mean, man, did they do whatever it took to try and bring that number down, but to what cost, right? To what degree, or what impact has that had? We're obviously seeing the numbers right now. Mike, you know better than anybody about the impact on supply and demand right now and what's moving and what's not. We're also now saying, hey, listen, interest rates are so high, 78% of Canadians are struggling to make their ends meet without dipping into home equity lines of credit or other forms of credit. It's not a great time. You have to use the word recession. Our neighbors to the south are now saying we actually have touched on recession, or they have, with 2 consecutive segments of negative growth. Tell me about, are we in recession territory? How does that play in terms of an election that's on the horizon? And how closely are we still related to our neighbors to the south?
Yeah. So in the Bloomberg Nanos tracking that we do, which is a confidence index, for the last 15 years, the confidence index predicts where the GDP numbers will be about 6 months in advance. And, what we see is kind of a mild economic downturn in 2020, in the first 2 quarters of 2024. We may be technically in a recession, but it'll be small. It's not going to be a deep recession. And, the other thing is to your point, Arif, about the U.S., our economy is completely interlocked and interlinked with the United States. It's kind of like if the U.S. sneezes, we get a cold kind of deal. So we have to watch what's going to happen. The other thing is, what will the impact of the political environment in the United States have on the U.S. economy? And another thing, we're not here to talk about foreign policy, but there's been work by Bloomberg economists that suggests that if the conflict in the Middle East is contained to Israel and Hamas, it'll be kind of like even Steven. If the conflict broadens to include other Middle Eastern countries or beyond that, the probability of a recession, a global recession, starts to increase. So, the thing is we all have, let's set aside the politics, we have a really strong economic reason to make sure that whatever happens in the Middle East does not spread and does not escalate, because that'll be bad for the global economy in terms of uncertainty and what might transpire in 2024.
Yeah, bringing it back for a minute to housing, within your polling that you do, how much of the solution that Canadians are looking for with regards to housing affordability and availability, is there a sense of how much of that the Canadian people think falls to the hands of government to remedy, and how much of it they think is like a private sector, or maybe just time itself is going to fix that?
Well, I think people mostly point their fingers at the municipal level of government, because they're kind of like the front line. Like, if you can't build, like, who cares what programs are out there if the environment at the local level is not conducive to bringing the supply that's needed. And the other thing that's occurred is that we did a survey on interlinking perceptions related to immigration and housing, and a majority of Canadians believe that we should be scaling back our level of immigration, not stopping immigration, but scaling back until housing becomes more affordable. Because let's face it, when you look at the number of Canadians, new people that are being brought into the country, it's like 450,000 or thereabouts. It's in that range. That's like bringing in a city of Hamilton every year. It'd be like, welcome Hamilton to Canada. Like, the question is, where are these folks, going to live? And, people are not experts in the housing market, but they know that if you bring 400,000 or 500,000 new people into the country, they have to live someplace. And I think this puts a highlight on the fact that the federal government made a decision on immigration, which they are entitled to do, but they have to talk to the provinces and the municipalities on things like, well, where are these people going to live if we're going to bring in new individuals? So we're seeing a collision of these issues happen right now.
So speaking of availability and affordability and immigration, we recently had a conversation with the CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association, Tim Hudak, and we asked the question because it's been floated there by members, certain contributors to Ottawa and in the think tanks, et cetera, that happen there, about maybe we need to address the issue of short-term rentals taking up a bunch of the housing stock and supply. And if we actually were to put a moratorium on that, would it, as a question, not a statement, but would it address some of the availability issues and the challenges faced by immigrants not finding homes, or even people who are already here not being able to find housing?
Yeah, I think the reality is so I don't think anyone really believes that there's a single thing that can be done. Like, we have to do multiple things. And, Arif, what you just put on the table is one thing that could happen. And, think of it this way. If people are struggling to find an affordable place to live, it'd be like, if someone's got an idea, it's like, put up your hand, got an idea. Okay, let's try that. And maybe it'll make a little difference, but it won't, my point is that we have to have a number of ideas like that. We have to talk about zoning. We have to talk about investment. We have to talk about, short-term rentals and what the strategies are for short-term rentals, so that there's just more supply out there. All those things have to be talked about. And, the thing is I would hazard to say that average Canadians are happy to look at a number of different things and would probably be more confident than a politician that says, I have the solution. It is this. And be like, oh, come on. You're trying to boil the ocean. That's just never going to happen.
Yeah. So many of us wake up, we turn to the newspaper looking for your numbers, your polling, your data, your research. I got to assume that machine learning, there's a more general question, artificial intelligence is finding its way into the world of analysis and into the work that you do. Is technology going to advance the caliber of the data and the information that we receive going forward? Or?
Well, it will enhance how quickly we can turn things around. And we use machine learning for very specific things. We don't use it to do an analysis, but we do use machine learning. So we'd have like an open-ended question, like, why do you have this opinion? Well, in the olden days, we'd have people read each answer and go, this is in category 3. That is in category 5. And then you manually go through. Well, now we can have machine learning put things into categories. But our rule of thumb is that whenever we use machine learning, which we have for the last 5 years, there always has to be a human intervention. It's kind of like real estate. You know what? There always has to be a realtor as part of the mix in a real estate transaction, because you don't want to make a mistake. You want to know that everything is going to be good, that yes, you trust the technology, but you need a human to be the expert to say, yes, this does make sense. So that's how it's kind of working for us.
Make sure you grab that screenshot later as a plug for your service.
That was a valuable statement right there.
Nik, I got to ask you this question, though, before we lose our time with you. You're in the business of polling. You're in the business of collecting data and then deciphering the data and then presenting the data. I want to go back to the fact that there's fact versus fiction, or there's fact versus emotion and opinions. You're in the opinions business. If I'm making a statement, my question to you is, are humans ever wrong?
Sure. Yeah. Well, hey, can I tell you something? People think that they're making the right, whenever we have an election, for the first 2 months, they think they made the right decision. And then afterwards they regret it. Right. They'd be like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like they're validated. But, the thing is that people are not experts. However, we have to respect how people feel, because you need political license in order to get things done. And you have to understand how to move things forward. So are the polls wrong? Not if they're done correctly. But the thing is that, are they going in the right direction? Like, people elected Donald Trump, right? Whether you love or hate the guy, is that the best decision or not? Nobody knows. But I think depending on where you sit on the spectrum, you might think the U.S. needed a Donald Trump to smash the establishment into little bits. Or you might have thought, I can't believe that Donald Trump, or in denial that he could even win. And that's really where things kind of play themselves out.
I can't think of a better way to wrap this up, Mike. I mean, Nick, it's always great to sort of get your perspective, and you've got your fingers on the pulse, literally, of the people.
Yep.
I sometimes myself have that internal dialogue about, what could people possibly be thinking? You really started the show. What are these leaders of the political parties thinking? Are they actually watching the numbers? We got to go. You got to go. We're out of time with you, but I can't think of a more fun guest that we've had, and being able to take these numbers. I think we said it to you the last time that you were here, Nick. Mike and I both agreed. You take a topic that is otherwise boring by all accounts, that who would want to look at statistics and numbers, and you make it fun and you make it easy to ingest and digest and comprehend. Mike, parting thoughts?
Well, I just want to say thanks once again, Nick, for your time, your insights. And yes, you are the pulse of what's going on in the country here, and look forward to future dialogues with you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on the show. Take it easy.
Thank you. So stand by. We'll be right back with more Hitting Home with Mike and Arif.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And wow, Mike, once again, right between the eyes with the information from Nick, it's hard to ignore the numbers and how he's really interpreting them. I think certainly on a federal level, and all the things that are on the minds of people, we're talking housing, we're talking about the economy, we're talking politics. My takeaway, though, he's not being shy about it. Unless something really significant happens, change is in the air.
For sure. Well, let's take all that information that we've been provided with here in the first three segments of the show. And for our final segment here, let's distill it down to how it impacts you and me and everybody else, all the viewers here at the local level here. Because he did touch on the point that, the buck stops at the municipal level with regards to housing. So let's go.
And he wasn't shy about that either, Mike. And I think one of the things that I heard was, it doesn't matter what people think. It matters that people think that it's at the local level where these challenges need to be addressed. And I found that really quite fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And again, the wasn't a federal budget that was tabled this week, but it was the fall economic forecast. But within that, there was mention of, I can't recall exactly how many billions of dollars would be earmarked for housing and dealing with the housing challenges here. If not tomorrow, then sometime in the next 2 or 3 years. And that's unfortunate. A lot of these promises often do include that, beginning in 2016 or something, rather than tomorrow, which is when we need the funding, which is when we need these things to happen. But at that local level, with that federal funding that has been coming down, have we, and are we seeing any changes as a direct result of promises made and funds being transferred from the federal government?
Well, and I think that that's something that he talked about, as well as that back in 2015, a whole series of promises were made. And there's somebody else out there who's certainly collecting screenshots and grabbing sound bites and clips and have stitched it together. And you can actually see from 2015 straight through to 2021 or 2022, sort of the position from the Prime Minister on the federal government's responsibility, housing affordability and housing availability. And he pretty much went from, we're going to address housing, straight through to most recently, housing's not my problem, or housing's not a federal issue. And it was interesting to see those sound bites sort of chronicled year over year. And yet here we are, really on the sort of tail end of this term, and in election territory, whether it's a 2024 or 25 election. And in this fall economic statement, they're still doubling down on the things that they really camped out on over the last 8 years, which is the environment, carbon tax, more social issues and social matters. But Nick really made a point of saying, what more social of an item could there be than social housing? He was surprised to see that there was a lack of pressure coming from also the NDP towards the Liberals to include more funding and more action, not just platitudes, not just talking points around getting housing sorted.
Yeah, and I would say one of the characteristics of good governing at any level, certainly at the federal level, is being able to adapt and change, because circumstances 3 or 4, 8-year term are likely to change. You do get conflicts, the international conflicts, you recessions. There's so many dynamics, and if you've cut your path and foresaw what you want to do in the next 4 years, and regardless of any influence from changes day to day, you're determined you're going to stick to that path as irrelevant as it may become. I don't think that's the best governing here. And here, let me just roll that into a hypothetical here. Not so much a hypothetical as a reality. At some point here, we are going to have a federal election, and all indicators are it's probably going to be a change of government. We know what's going to happen there. So the question is, with that change, do you think we are going to see the changes that are being promised with regards to housing initiatives coming from the federal level? Do you think sometimes you get that change and a lot's promised and then nothing really happens over the next few years? Is there a confidence level with you that we will actually see some of those changes implemented?
Yeah, great question, Mike. And by the way, I want to acknowledge that I'm really glad that you brought that last point up around sticking to your guns, even if the data is telling you should be doing otherwise. And I'll get to your question in just a second. The analogy for me that came up is a sailing analogy, and I am not a sailor, so any of us audience out there, correct me. But you set your course and you put your eye on the horizon or where you want to end up, and that's great. But through your entire journey, you've got to be making course corrections as the winds blow and as the waves impact you. And just as life happens, you need to constantly be adjusting so that you can eventually reach your destination. It's about the outcome as well. And I think that holds true for this government. Name me something that hasn't been impacted, from that original platform that got them elected in 2015. Has anything changed since 2015 that rings a bell for you? And I could think of so many things, even had there not been a global pandemic that impacted so many people in so many different ways for a period of time, would there not have been reason to course correct? So now to your question on what my gut instinct is telling me, I'm looking at, and we brought this up with Nik about, his thoughts that it's not really inside the federal purview to be addressing this, and look at what the opposition leader's been proposing for several months, if not longer, about how the federal government will put the pressure on the provinces and or local government to address housing, because it is a national issue. So do I think it's possible if we see, hypothetically, Mr. Poilievre take government with the Conservatives? One question will be, is it a majority, is it a super majority, or is it a minority government? What happens when you don't have that majority territory? Would there be a coalition? So he can say whatever he wants. It's going to be up to the people to determine how strong the mandate can and will be, and that will determine how effective he can be. Let's
how much power.
Exactly. So
how much power we're going to give him as a result of the election results. But one thing I would like to have seen with the current government that I'm hopeful with whoever comes in next time around, be it the same government again or a new government, a new party at the helm, I think we need to get all the parties to the table, and I don't mean just the parties, all levels of government together in a room. There needs to be a summit here with all players, and so far we haven't seen that. We've seen hints of that, and little attempts at that. But I think there needs to be an across the board, almost like a referendum level type of look with all parties involved. That hey, we've talked about doing this or this or this or throwing money here or here. what do all the mayors across the country think? What do all the provincial leaders across the country think? What do, and how we as federal government can play into making sure all of these things happen. We're not seeing that level of cooperation or determination. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with it. And we're in an interesting situation here because, you talk to the average person in conversation, it's like, oh, groupthink and governing by consensus. That's where nothing ever gets done. That's why I like being in business as opposed to being inside of a government organization where everything has to be a consensus. And it's an interesting conversation to have. I would have loved to have been able to have time to ask Nik about this. Like, I heard him when he said, I asked the question, are people ever wrong? And he was like, well, no. I mean, if people aren't wrong, and you have to be mindful of the will of the people. I'm interpreting what he said there, paraphrasing it. At the same time, a follow-up question really would be, okay, great. We've now had 8 years of this current government. At what point do we have to hold ourselves accountable for having given them that power? Because they're in majority territory, as they called it, the red wave last time around or the time before. The people gave them that supermajority or gave them that level of power. So the question is, do we want to see a pendulum swing the other direction? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And does a new government need that kind of power in order to make the corrective or take the corrective actions that people are calling for? Or there are those who will say, well, the best type of government is a minority because it holds each other accountable. What kind of a situation are we in? And we got to get the issues addressed, and we have to correct what's going on inside the average household. Mike, I want to throw it over to you. We got 30 seconds to wrap, or 10 seconds to wap it up. But I think we got to take the conversation up. 10
seconds doesn't leave me a whole lot to say but I will just summarize by saying, it was a good show and a lot of good topics were discussed here, and we certainly went to the source with regards to finding out what Canadians think nationally and here at home with regards to the politics and our housing situation. So with that, I would say thank you very much. It's been a great show, Arif, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif.
See you again.